And especially an important role that you can see in the archives and the exchange of letters in the 1930s is the role of facilitating communication and the transmission of information in the midst of state persecution. In the 1930s, many Apras are sent into exile again, and you have different communities of exile spread a bit around the map, right? So you have a community of political actors that are trying to talk to each other and understand how they're going to organize their political action. To do this, you need to be able to communicate. You don't have emails, you don't have phones. When you send letters to Peru, if you send it through people who know you, the censorship will take it. And then your friend who's in a clandestine retreat will never read the new plan you have to organize your political action. So in this sense, foreign allies are very important because you have people who travel around the world, like Ana Melissa Graves, and I'm coming to her, and then she can help out to transmit information, take propaganda from Peru and ship it to other countries, for instance, okay? So this case study is about Enrique Rojas and Ana Melissa Graves. Which begins by keeping in mind, please keep in mind this understanding that you have different communities of exile spread through the map, and they're trying to communicate with each other to organize and harmonize political action. Okay? The burden of distance and of outlawry weighted heavily on proper communication between leaders of Apra. I found in archives many letters of Apra exiles, be it in Chile, Argentina, and London, for instance, who were eager to receive fresh news from Peru. Many felt uninformed. They didn't know what was going on back home. They wanted to know more about the political situation in Peru. So, what was the politics like? How was this family member doing? How was that friend? Where was the party heading? Was this other compañera still in prison? In the 1920s, Ana Melissa Graves, she played an important role of intermediary for the young student leader at the time, Victor Raúl Aya de la Torre. This is where perhaps some of, well, the two of you maybe have heard her name. She's renowned for her work in the 1920s. Graves was an internationalist pacifist, okay? She fought for world peace and rejected any type of imperialism. Her motivations for initiating contact with young Latin American reformist students in the early 1920s was her lifelong quest against national divides and racial discrimination, which according to her led to traumatic events such as the First World War. She praised the continentalist framework of thinking of los reformistas rather than nationalist approach to Latin American problems. She saw in them the perfect allies to her cause, okay? She believed, a bit like Martin told you, she believed that in Latin America really lay new geographical utopias from where humanity would be able to be salvaged, right? In the face of Western decay in Europe, they needed to turn to Latin America and see the new potential for renovation. Ana Melissa Graves was particularly fond of Aya de la Torre. In September 1923, she wrote to Romain Rolland. Martin has mentioned his name. He's Swiss. He's a Francophone Swiss. And he's pacifist, like her. So she wrote, I quote, "The Señor Aya de la Torre of Lima, Peru is, I believe, the most selfless man I have ever met anywhere in the world." End of quote. About a year after she first met him, at some point toward the end of 1922, Graves described Aya de la Torre with a mix of admiration and protective instinct. She was particularly impressed with his stamina and resolve in helping the workers of Peru achieve a better education, something she had witnessed in his work with the popular universities, right? Las universidades populares. She was thrilled about this project. So during Aya's early years in exile, Graves helped maintain him in touch with friends and family members back home. This role of intermediary augmented its scope and range between 1932 and 1944. She began to exchange correspondence with many Apra members, including the following: Magda Portal, Felipe Cosigo del Polmar, Manuel Cox, Eduardo Goicochea, Luis Heisen, Alberto Hidalgo, Raúl Porras, Enrique Rojas, Luis Alberto Sánchez, Emmanuel Seoane. Foreign allies who traveled were crucial to the circulation of news and proper communication within the Apra movement. Graves traveled a lot for her work as a peace activist. So Aprista rapidly learned how to take benefit of her place to gather information about one another. She served as a conveyor of information between different communities of Aprista in exile who desperately tried to remain in touch with one another and to know what was going on in Peru. So here's a case study that illustrates this point, right? Enrique Roja and Ana Melissa Graves. Basically, the story is about Apristas in Buenos Aires asking Graves to deliver Aprista propaganda in Brazil, right? Be aware of how I use my primary sources in order to frame my argument about this condition of intermediary and of conveyor of information. As Secretary of Press and Propaganda of the Comité Aprista Peruano of Buenos Aires, it was Enrique Rojas' responsibility to keep a lookout for advertising opportunities in the Southern Cone. When in 1934, Argentine intellectual Gabriel del Mazo informed him that Ana Melissa Graves was stationed in Rio de Janeiro, he jumped on the opportunity and sent a letter of introduction along with 10 copies of the edition of the Apra magazine, which of course was published outside of Peru because of the censorship against the party at the time, right? So here are just a few, just to have a lookout, to have an understanding of how these pamphlets and these journals could look like. This is in 1931 when the Apra magazine was still legal. Still all the Apra magazines would be in pamphlets or in journal, but you will have images of what this could look like. On this page you have tenemos un solo y grande enemigo, el imperialismo. Formemos una sola y grande unión, el Partido Aprista Peruano. And you have someone who looks like Zapata, right? So the ideal of the Mexican Revolution is portrayed in this Apra magazine. Then you have another picture celebrating the first May 1st. Trabajadores manuales intelectuales del Perú, formada el Frente Único de la Justicia, right? This idea of a united front between different social classes to come together against the imperialist enemy. And then you have a third one, again in 1931, in Julio. The elections were in October, so this you have a sense of how it tried to shape propaganda at the national level so that it could attract or just tune its ideology so that it serves the interests of the indigenous people. And here you have El Gamonal, right, a great landlord, and you have in the back, you have indigenous people, and you have El Apra reivindicará el indio, right? So symbols of oppression and how the Apra wants to fight on the side of the oppressed. All right, so now I'm going back to the text, but just you have this type of propaganda that Rojas asked Graves to bring with her to Brazil so that she can distribute it in Rio de Janeiro. I quote from Rojas, "Hemos de agradecerle la distribución de esos ejemplares," Rojas wrote on May 28, 1934, "a fin de que muchos brasileros puedan ir enterándose de nuestro movimiento y decidan formar un comité allí." Though Rojas and Graves had never met, the good words that the Aprista exile had for her in their initial correspondence shows that by 1934, her reputation of support and amity had been made among Aprista circles. "Desde hace tiempo sentimos profunda estimación por usted y anhelamos conocerla personalmente," Rojas gently courted after exposing his request. Between May 1934 and December 1943, the exchange of correspondence that followed this first connection showcases a mutual dependence between Enrique Rojas and Ana Melissa Graves for receiving fresh news from Peru. In March 1935, Rojas was impatient to hear from Graves, I quote, "when plenty news of Victor en Peru," end of quote. When Rojas craved news from Peru in March of 1935, Graves had just returned from a short stay in Lima, Peru. She had entered in communication at the time with various Aprista members, although unsuccessfully attempted to meet with Aya. All right, so what this story tells us is that Graves' condition as a world traveler enabled her to be where Aprista exiles could not be. Being in Peru enabled her to collect fresh impressions and precious news for Aprista exiles about the state persecution, about sus compañeros. Though the collections of documents found in archives do not give access to Graves' letters to Rojas, the details that the latter attempted to draw about the Apra party, as well as the opinions that he voiced in his letters to Graves, suggest that she received his missive with great enthusiasm. It's more, it suggests that she asked Rojas to keep her posted about the activities of the Apra party, right? So both were telling each other, let's keep each other posted with what we know, since information was never complete. Now, what started as a request for material assistance grew into a lasting intellectual relationship. In effect, the first connection turned into a decade-long epistolary friendship during which Graves and Rojas exchanged information, this is true, but also opinions and ideas about politics and the state of affairs in Peru and the Americas. So a case study, right, to illustrate the first point, in providing information, in helping to do propaganda work. Let us now turn to the second point, in the defense of party leaders, okay? Here I'm going to return to a case study that Martín mentioned, which is after the arrest of Víctor Raúl Aya de la Torre in May 1932, you have the organization throughout the Americas, but also in Europe, of an immense transnational advocacy campaign that argued that made pressure on the Peruvian government to release Aya de la Torre, okay? So my case study is going to be about how Ana Melissa Graves helped a lot in triggering this campaign. Okay. Solidarity protests in favor of the Peruvian Apra party and of Víctor Raúl Aya de la Torre in particular proliferated across the Americas following his arrest in May 1932. In the aftermath of the Trujillo uprising and the ensuing wave of persecution that targeted Apra members in Peru, many echoed the words of encouragement that Costa Rican intellectual Joaquín García Monge extended to Ana Melissa Graves. By then an important figure of the internationalist pacifist movement, right? You will remember this, important. So García Monge writes these words at the beginning of 1933, I quote, "Las gestiones que usted está haciendo en los Estados Unidos son muy buenas, muy útiles y en el momento oportuno serán aprovechadas por los amigos de Aya en el mundo." End of quote. In this citation, García Monge was referring to the movement of support, the movement in support of Víctor Raúl Aya de la Torre that Graves had helped put together a few months earlier. So between May 1932 and August 1933, European, North American, and Latin American intellectuals joined efforts following Graves' instruction and embarked on a transnational advocacy campaign that condemned the recent conviction in Peru of Apra leader Aya de la Torre. The petitions they forwarded to Peruvian ambassadors in Washington, D.C., London, and Paris, as well as the letters that they published in daily papers, together denounced the poor prison conditions under which Aya de la Torre was being held captive. International Apra supporters requested a fair trial or immediate deportation for Aya, right? The goal was to take him out of these prisons. They feared for his life. Although these letters and petitions ultimately only gathered a few dozen supporters on paper, the one initiated by Graves, right? But there were other campaigns at the same time and everybody talked to one another. But so although it gathered a few dozen supporters on paper, the fame many of these enjoyed worldwide gave legitimacy to their transnational initiative, right? The question of fame is very important here. Internationally, renowned intellectuals demanded that Peruvian authorities be held responsible in the face of liberal and pacifist public opinion.